Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Riggs. I'm Director of Administration here at NEMA and want to introduce you guys to our Ask the Conservators July edition. As some of you know, this is one of my favorite sessions. Don't tell the other PAG chairs because I think it's so cool and neat. But I'm going to turn it over to Jen Weltson. She is our Director of Programming and Advocacy for our land acknowledgement.
Everybody, thanks for joining us this afternoon. So NEMA's land acknowledgement. Virtual spaces cannot replace the lands that sustain and empower us. Today, I'm based in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, homelands of the Wampanoag people and their allied tribes past and present. NEMA recognizes that our organization and those of our members were founded within a colonizing society that continues exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout the New England area and beyond. I'll drop this link in the chat in a second, but you can use the Indigenous Peoples land map to locate the lands where your museum is located and where you were zooming in from today. And thank you again.
Thanks, Jen. So I will turn it over to Camille and Barrett, our PAG chairs for the Conservators, and they can introduce our special guest today.
Hi, everybody. This is Camille talking. In our last session, Barrett, unbeknownst to me, decided to give a rundown of my career in life. So, of course, I have to return the favor and embarrass Barrett. So, a few things you don't know about him. He was born in Berkeley, California, despite his accent, but he grew up on Cape Cod. He began building boats at an early age, and he traveled the world for 5 years as a captain in the Merchant Marines. He worked with oil companies in Egypt and Austria. I don't quite understand how you work for an oil company in Austria, but whatever. Before he returned to the Cape in 1986. Boat building and furniture making sparked Barrett's interests in furniture conservation. And while he raised his 4 children, he managed to complete his education through the Smithsonian Furniture Conservation Program at the Getty Conservation Institute and at the Winterthur Museum. He is the first to tell you that curiosity is what has kept him in private practice for 37 years. It takes a lot. And along with the unique blend of chemistry, history, and craftsmanship that really makes up conservation. So Barrett has known our guest, Howard Newman, for a long time, but this is my first meeting with Howard. So Howard, why don't you give us a little bit of an introduction into your career and what it is that you do in conservation?
Well, it's interesting to hear about. First of all, I want to thank Jen, Heather, Barrett, and you, Camille, for inviting me. It's a really generous and nice thing to do and give me a chance to just be the center of attention in my own little garret here. Anyway, when I hear from what you tell me about Barrett, that you were in the Merchant Marine and so forth, to me that the key of a successful life in a way is to do a lot of weird stuff when you're young, and you did that. My wife and I, this was back in the 60s, my wife and I got involved in Peace Corps training and wind up at a special forces training camp in the jungle in Puerto Rico for 4 months, where we learned things like survival training and being tied up and jumping into the deep end of a pool and surviving. And wow. Stuff like that. And then we wound up, we didn't go to South America. Instead, we went to Laredo, Texas as Vista volunteers and spent a year living at a deserted orphanage on the banks of the Rio Grande River, where you could hear the music from the whorehouses across the way late at night, which was great music, by the way. And we lived there for a year and moved to New York City. And I worked as a legal aid in an operation called Mobilization for Youth, which was part of the war on poverty back then. Wound up deciding I had to figure out what I was going to do with my life. And I wound up going to RISD and getting a degree in silversmithing from a man named John Pripp, who is known as the Dean of American Silversmiths, a master's in sheet metal forming, and then had the good fortune to get a Fulbright and moved to Italy for a year and living in a 16th century farmhouse in Tuscany. And there I started making models for making bronze castings and started making castings in Italy. And between then and now have produced over 250 bronze castings, many of my own. And then when we decided to, that was because I had a wonderful dealer named Arna Ekstrom in New York City who sold bronzes like you sell donuts. I mean, it was an unbelievable thing. And anyway, but that came to an end around 1990, and my wife and I decided we had to have a more sensible kind of life, and which would be interesting to know what you guys think about that, but we chose restoration and conservation as a more sensible way of doing things. And it actually has been very successful. We name our company Restoration because when we lived outside of Florence, it was 5 years after the destructive flood of the Arno that destroyed vast amounts of cultural property, and the first show of everything that had been restored or partially restored was called Il Restauro di Firenze, which means the restoration of Florence. And so when I came time to figure out a name, I thought, you know what? I like that. That was really, I have a feeling was the beginning of a lot of the world's emphasis on conservation and restoration. So that's what we named it. And since then we've done, I assume it's 1,000 projects. Like Barrett said, we have it upstairs in another studio, but he has these piles in his extra bedroom, of slides and pictures and 35 millimeter roll, negatives, on and on and on, of, like I said, over 1,000 projects. Many of them involve metal. More recently, we've gotten involved in stone conservation and restoration involving marbles. We restored 20 marble busts for Brown University's Hay Library Reading Room. And since then have done several others. You can see them on our some of them on our website. And you can also see them on our YouTube channel. There. There.
Thank you, Howard.
Sure.
You bring up a very interesting point. I just got a phone call a few minutes ago from a cultural agency, an archive in Vermont that has been impacted by the floods in the last 2 days.
Oh,
So
wow.
I don't have my, I can't see what the comments are without changing my camera here, but I wanted to encourage anybody that may have come on to attend this, who is dealing with any kind of emergency situation based on that, to absolutely put a question in the comments, and Heather will let us know. But we're happy to address any kind of emergency response issues that you might have that are particularly timely today. Yeah. Okay, well, I would like to perhaps dive right into the questions that were sent ahead, and it'll give Howard a little bit of an idea of what kind of help that we try to provide during this. So one of those questions was about an African screen that one of our NEMA members has in their institution. And if I remember correctly, Barrett, this screen has been fumigated 3 times before, but still shows signs of active powder post beetles. And we have told people before where to get objects fumigated. And Barrett, I wondered if you could talk about what kind of fumigation that is, and really whether there are any viable alternatives to that kind of anoxic fumigation.
Sure. Is the person who asked the question here, Heather? Does she
Hi,
want?
I'm
does she wanna-
Charlotte.
Hey, Charlotte, what could you tell us about your screen?
Yeah, so I just found out about this screen. I've only been at the museum for 6 months, or a little over, and was contacted by Williamstown Conservation Center in Massachusetts. I should say I'm in Bridgeport, Connecticut, at the Housatonic Museum of Art.
Yeah.
So we were alerted that they still had this screen of ours. They at Williamstown Conservation Center have done 2 anoxic treatments, one of which was at 0.004. It was very, very low. percent for 37 days. And for whatever reason, the screen never made its way back to us. So they just kind of stumbled upon it, and we were trying to figure out what to do. But when they went and looked at it, it is just covered in frass. It's still wrapped.
Sorry, covered in what?
Frass, bug waste.
Okay.
So the infestation is definitely still active. So they're going to examine it again, but I guess our question is, at this point, it seems unlikely that there's really much wood left. So if they're, if they clean it up and there's not much structure to it left, what are really the options left to us? We're a very small museum. We have a small budget, so we're sort of in the debating the worth of continuing to treat this piece, with the risk of future infestations, the risk of bringing it back into our collection, and potentially, causing infestation to other pieces. And like, we've never done a deaccession. So, is that the best option? So that's kind of where we're at with this piece.
Okay. Thank you for sharing that. That doesn't sound like the typical scenario. Usually, if you do anoxic treatment, which to people out there who don't know, it's usually a bubble that they inject a gas like nitrogen, an inert gas that removes most of the oxygen in the air, so that the insects, in this case the supposed powder post beetles, can't live. And that is the best way. That's the gold standard on how to treat these insects. I wonder where, you said it was Williamstown, right, that did it? I wonder where they took it. The only place I know is, we always recommend Historic New England, up in Haverhill. They have used to be a carbon dioxide CO2 bubble, but I think they're now using nitrogen. And it is about a 3-week to 4-month process where they lower the moisture in the bubble. But it's the best treatment for artifacts because it really works. It's not deleterious to the finish or the wooden structure of the object. So that's why I'm very surprised that they treated this twice. My first gut reaction is when you say that there's still an infestation. My question would be, how do they know there's still an infestation? Because what I find is very few people are knowledgeable about what actually tells you that there is an active infestation. And the tell is that you have to have new frass. And again, to people who don't know, frass is the slight sawdust that comes out when the larvae hatch from their eggs inside the wood. They're hungry and they live off the starches and other chemicals that are in the wood, and they produce this very bright sawdust, almost the same color as the frame there in the background. And what a lot of people do is they will see old frass, which is always there, which is more like an ochre color. It's oxidized, and they make the mistake of thinking that there's still an infestation, where that old frass gets knocked out of the holes when the piece is moved or bumped into. So that would be my first question: is, are they really sure that it's an active infestation? Because usually anoxic treatment works very well. If it isn't working, then yeah, you've got a problem, like you say. You don't want it to spread. The best way to prevent it from spreading to the collection is you want to bag it. There are large polyethylene bags. You want to completely keep that thing in the bag. Another great way to tell if the infestation is truly active is you can put a black poster board under the piece. and just let it sit there, and you can see the frass that falls on it, and you'll get a great color transition, you know, seeing the black to the frass. But again, new frass it's very bright yellow, as opposed to old frass is got that oxidized ochre color. So that's the key thing there. And I'm wondering if somebody is looking at old frass, because usually that procedure works. The other procedures I wouldn't recommend at all. There are chemicals like Vicane and bromide gas and powders, which they don't penetrate deep into the wood like the gas does. So it sounds like you've done everything right. As far as deaccessioning, I mean, where are you gonna, it's hard to deaccession it. You don't want to give something with a live infestation to someone else. But I don't think you have to go to that route. I would you know, take it up to Historic New England, or ask Williamstown where they did the treatment, and maybe get a second opinion on the infestation and whether it is in fact live still.
Good question. Fortunately, deaccessioning questions are a curatorial matter, and we try to provide the technical information to help you make that decision. But as Barrett said, you know, I think we've all seen pieces that have come to institutions from places that knew they had a problem. I have a famous story about a settee that was upholstered by a very famous person that many of us know from television, and they covered over an existing carpet beetle infestation. And when a colleague of mine went to work on it, the graphic descriptions of just removing spoonfuls of live carpet beetles is fantastic. Nice and gruesome, but those things do happen. So I would be interested to know what the accepted methods of dealing with objects like that are. And what we haven't really mentioned is that this object was made in Africa by a known African tradition of craftsmanship. So perhaps reaching out to the Smithsonian and speaking to somebody specifically in the African wooden artifacts specialty area would also be helpful for you. Just there could be anecdotal information about things that are specific to this type of artifact that they could help you with also.
That's great advice, Camille. And I forgot one point to address. One point is also the funding. You said you're a small museum and you don't have the funding for that. And Camille and I have been having a lot of discussions lately about there is so much funding available. There are so many grants available. The funding is out there. You just need somebody who's dedicated to writing the grant applications and things like that. So I wouldn't give up on a piece with that historical importance to your collection that quickly without researching the monies that are out there and available. I think that's our next life. We have to come back as funding experts for showing institutions how to fund the treatments for their objects, because it's out there. It's out there. It's just, it's a specialization. I always have my famous line is it was Sarah Brophy, the grant expert, had a great line where she said, if there's grants for absolutely everything out there that you can imagine. She said, if you look for a grant for a three-legged black Labrador dog, there's a grant for three-legged black Labrador dogs out there. They're out there. Anything you want, you just have to find it, and you just have to have somebody who specializes in writing grant applications. So,
Howard, I'm curious. Some of these big projects that I read about on your website, did you have to go through the process of examining, bidding, and then waiting for funding to come up? Have any funding related stories?
Many of the things that we do, nobody else can do. And so I don't know why that is. It just, you know, maybe it's because I was working in a lathe when I was 10 years old. I'm not really sure, but a lot of it is a combination of the way you think about things. And what you can actually do with your hands is a significant part, but a big piece of it is learning how to think from the general to the particular, back to the general, down to the particular, back and forth all the time. And so a lot of times people approach us, and matter of fact, we advertise it. If you can't find anybody to do a job, come to us, you know. And coming from a family of risk takers, you know, I'll go and try to figure it out. But it's so much of what I do and what my assistants, we only have one assistant right now. What to me is special about it is the fact that we all come from these very, part of our life is from a very general liberal arts background. Like I didn't mention, I had 3 years of architecture at Miami University, and then finally left that and wound up spending my last 2 years in getting a bachelor's in anthropology and cultural anthropology. So this all this kind of stuff is a long way of saying that it will finally gets to us. We very often are the only ones who can do it. And then if it hasn't already been decided who by the institution who's going to fund this thing, we do it. There's a certain amount of back and forth but the institution will find the funding. But we wind up, you know, negotiating with them, with the funder.
Yeah, it's a big challenge, especially for those of us in private practice. You mentioned how much of a conservator's job is this what we call non-billable work. Our brains are going 24 hours a day, and our ideas occur while we're doing other things, and trying to keep a balance within any conservation project, any big project, between the executing the thing that you're being paid to do, your job, and then doing all that background thinking that makes your job excellent, or allows you to, in our case, you know, remain profitable, even though there's so much that goes on outside of that time clock, so to speak. That's a big challenge for us. How have you managed it through the years?
Well, we went through all the perfunctory discussions, which weren't perfunctory when we did them. My wife and I would say, well, gee, do we charge more if we go to pick something up than when we're working on it? You know, what about when I dream about it at night? You know, what about if I get up in the morning and have the answer? How much time did I spend in the middle of the night thinking about this thing, you know? And so I discount that particular thing, but the rest of it, we wound up with a very simple procedure. Which is any process, any job that we do goes from clean shop to clean shop. And we have a very, I'm sure there's a lot of them, but we use a computerized app called Office Time. And we use that. And when I start doing absolutely anything for a job, I turn it on, and it gives me a place to put notes. You know, and if I need to do that, I'll put in, you know, administration or the project itself or whatever. And it starts when I start messing up my shop and pulling everything out. And it's all done when I clean the shop completely up, where it looks like it never happened, and we've gotten our final payment and it's all done.
Wow.
That is just plain as, I mean, it's simple, you know, and one of the things that happens is it gives you a way of rating what you do based on the fundamental simple principle that a job, it has to do with a particular job if you can't do something else while you're doing it. It's that simple. You know, so put that together, and I use my little time clocker thing, and at the end, but I use that to keep track for historical terms, because I have a whole spreadsheet that I evolved over the years that when I give quotes, I don't say, well, you know, I'll give them maybe people a list of, you know, the general processes that I'm using, but I give them a quote and I say, look, I'll take my risk on it. If I blew this, it's my nickel, you know? And if I may out great, well, fine, we're happy. And people say, well, if it comes in less, will you charge me less? And I go, I'll tell you what, why don't we average in the last 30 projects and we'll come up with that answer, So,
Or 30 emails.
right. And you know what it comes at, and a lot of people are fun to talk with, and a lot of people are a pain in the, so anyway, I don't necessarily charge people extra for that, but it might.
Our audience are all our clients right now.
So be nice.
I'm curious. You made me think of something else, Howard, which is the fact that one of our goals is to determine what needs to be done by a conservator and what else can be done by a collection specialist with some training. So that brought to mind another query that was sent ahead, which was about a gown made by Ann Lowe, a fashion designer who's received a lot of exposure recently. She's one of America's first African-American fashion designers who reached fame, and she's most known for a rather boring wedding gown worn by Jacqueline Kennedy. And the question that came in was about the beading on this Ann Lowe dress and the fact that beads are falling off because the thread that has attached them is rotting. And I have firsthand experience with this, also working on a beaded Ann Lowe gown that was loaned to Winterthur, it was loaned to the Met, but Winterthur has had some ongoing Ann Lowe exhibitions going on. So the question really is about where to draw the line between any rebeading that one does to reapply beadings or to restore missing beadings, and then all of the rest of the beads which are held on by this rotting cotton thread. And the question was sort of like, what do we do? Do we preventively resew every bead on or not? And that's an excellent question. I can say that we did not preventively go through every bead on the dress and sew it. We worked in the immediate area of need on this dress and then slightly outside of that area in order to sort of create a bridge between areas that were exhibiting rotting thread and missing beads, and then into the areas of stabilization. Did that need to be done by a textile conservator, every single minute of that? Yes, but if preventive measures were being taken, which was a decision you would make along with the lending institution, between the lending institution and the borrowing institution, you might discuss whether additional preventive stitching could be done. And in this case, if a consultation was made between, say you had a collections care specialist with lots of needlework experience and a fundamental understanding of conservation priorities, if you received some instruction on how to do that safely, then it doesn't need to be done by a conservator necessarily. But the larger question, which is, to me, is how much wear and tear are you putting on this object by handling enough to go through all of these beads? Some beads may crack, they might lose their finish, things like that. I believe that a conservator or somebody that's expert in looking at these gowns, like maybe somebody back at Winterthur, they would know whether the existence of weak thread throughout would make the garment ineligible for exhibition in the worst case scenario, or requires a little more preventive conservation, which they could do as part of your loan agreement, or whether you would make sure to cater to the specific needs of this garment and be extra careful in mounting, exhibiting, handling, etc. That's sort of the spectrum that you would visit, and you need to make that decision together with the other team. And don't forget that they have lots of resources. They have more resources than you do, and that should be part of your discussion. How's that for a politically neutral answer? But I definitely feel your pain.
I'm curious. I'm brand new in your group. Okay, brand new, and I work, like I said, in my garret here, and so a lot of my thinking just is out of my own head. And but in terms of the object you're talking about, and again, please, anybody say what they think. This is just new stuff to me. seems to me that taking that, if it's not going to be worn or anything, and it's going to be mounted on a board or something, that immersing or somehow putting a very, very dilute consolidant in the whole thing means that what's really going on is that the fibers have come apart, or deteriorated. And if you made something that linked the fibers together everywhere in this garment, which may all be on the way to rotting, you would preserve it.
And that's not standard for practice. The one of the things that's going on is the sewing thread is definitely cotton, which is cellulosic, and it is susceptible to acidic conditions. The dress is made of silk, which is naturally acidic. So because it's an animal fiber. So essentially the chemical setup for deterioration was made at the time the decisions were made. If we were to do a coating, you would be putting a coating on everything other than the thread. You'd be putting it on the fabric, you'd be putting it on the outside of the beads, when really it's just this fundamental chemical imbalance. So the most aggressive procedure would be to rebead all of the beads. But of course, like Howard said, the condition of the silk is questionable. Fortunately, the curatorial team and the lending institution, the borrowing institution, and also people who understand the history of the dresses made by this particular dressmaker, 20th century dressmaker, that all adds to the decision-making process of whether this can withstand being put on a mannequin, put in an exhibition, taken off, shipped back, etc. But I would say 25 years ago, consolidants and treating textile objects with coatings, etc., was more part of the game plan. But it's almost completely reserved for very particular cases nowadays, because you can't ever take it off, can't undo it, and textiles are so flexible, and they have to be able to move freely, and so anything you put coat on it would not respond the same way as the textile. It would crack, it would flake, etc. So it's such a complicated challenge we have.
Heather,
Oh, go on.
I Camille's got me. She's piqued my interest on this dress thing. I have a question I want to ask her about another famous dress. But first, is there another question in the queue that we should get?
Yes, there is a question that came in through the chat. Could you address the pros and cons of polishing brass objects versus lacquering them? This question comes from a small historic house museum with many candlesticks and drawer pulls.
Okay, Howard, how would you deal with that?
That's a very common thing, and there is no. The answer is like this: it starts off with the issue of do no harm, number one, but also how do you wish the object to appear into the future? Now, if you polish it and you don't lacquer it, it will eventually tarnish again. Now, the question is, tarnish is an oxide that on non-ferrous metals is basically a way that the metal itself becomes passivated. Once it starts, it becomes less and less active in the environment. So if you expect it to be always polished, then you have to take the compromise of lacquering it, which makes it look not as good as it would look if it weren't lacquered. On the other hand, if you put a very, very slight or allowed a very slight amount of passivating oxide onto the surface, and then you didn't polish it later, but did something, let's say waxed it, you would retard it. You wouldn't stop it. We restored the entire metal contents of Toro Synagogue here in Newport. There were 150 objects, and many of them, a whole bunch of them were the 6 chandeliers. They were all brass, and we wound up doing both of what I said. We wound up putting a slight oxide on the surface to passivate it, and then putting a very suitable lacquer on the surface. And that was, well, that was about 15 years ago. And I go into that building all the time, and it just sits there. So maybe that's the answer, is that compromise, is polish it or don't, or highlight it and don't try to make it brand new, and then lacquer it, and accept the idea that lacquering is just a little bit funky, but it's better than the alternative. We actually, that business of cleaning things like that, we had during the 1990s, we did more than 50 projects for the Newport mansions. And one of them, which the curator at the time, Paul Miller, gave us was the 1853 Tiffany centerpiece. Is a gigantic. I have it in our website, but it's a centerpiece. Oh, I would say it's 2 feet high. And we went to see the people at Chateau-sur-Mer, where it was always exhibited. And they said, yep, every year we take that and we put this stuff on it. We get all that black stuff out of there. And I said, well, that's like trying to make a drawing work by taking all the graphite off of it. You know, that it doesn't work that way. What you want to do is find out what the artist intended, get close to that, although not exactly to it, and then try to retard it from happening. And in that case, we also lacquered everything. Does that answer most of that?
Yes, yeah, I agree with Howard. In my end of the business, we're usually dealing with historic brasses on furniture, and it is that you either clean them and let them patinate naturally as they oxidize just sitting in the room, or we will lacquer them. Usually, we've discovered some very old-fashioned good ways to lacquer them. Usually, we'll use shellac that's dyed with some dyes to give it a very beautiful, just gentle patina, and instead of traditional brass lacquers, which can look plasticky and take away from the natural feeling. But I was talking to Howard about brass cleaning, which is really I think at his end of the business, I think he runs into probably, with sculpture and statues, patination.
Yeah.
It's a very important thing. What he was describing as that being part of the artist's intention, that purposeful patination, which people want to clean off, and that is not something you want to clean off. It's something that's important to the identity of the piece. But with us, it's the cleaning issues that we find, is that we find, unfortunately, people cleaning brasses with ammoniated cleaners, which are your cheap hardware store cleaners, that work very quickly, because that's what most people want. They want to clean things as quick as possible, which unfortunately has deleterious results. And the problem is ammonia actually eats the brass molecules. That's why it cleans so quickly. And if you look at brass under a microscope, it's like Swiss cheese. It has a very irregular atomic structure, and the ammonia tends to stay in those caves of pockets that are in the brass, and they just continue. The ammonia gas keeps continuing to eat away at the brass, and the result of that chemical reaction of the ammonia and the brass is the whitish green residue that you see, that we call bronze disease or brass disease or brass oxidation. And so just about every house we go into, there's somebody who has taken these ammoniated brass, highly abrasive brass cleaners, and they scrub them in place. They take off the finish. They make a big ring around the hardware on the piece. And when we tell them how we do it, we remove every piece of hardware, we mount it on a board, we clean it with calcium carbonate, which is chalk, with a toothbrush. It's the least abrasive material that you can do it with, and it doesn't take away any of the tool marks from the 1700 brasses. And then we sterilize them and make that decision that Howard talked about. Are we going to leave them alone to self-patinate, or put on something like some shellac and some toned shellac to give it a particular look that it would have had. So, but the ammoniated brass cleaners are the big no-no, and also taking them to brass places where they clean them on buffing wheels, which Howard could probably do a better job of explaining this, but the heat and the friction from these buffing wheels that these brass cleaners use actually they actually melt the surface of the brass, the very, very surface of it, so that it's melting into each other, and you're going to lose any tool marks if or chase marks if you're going to clean things that way. But yeah, it's sort of the same thing, although in the sculpture end of the world, I know Howard's dealing more with patination, which is very important.
We've actually we deal with all that stuff. And one of them, something I do actually, I would like anybody's critique about this, Barrett, maybe instead of using any kind of abrasive at all, what I do is I assume that what you're really trying to remove is the oxide.
Mm-hmm.
And that by using thiourea, very dilute thiourea, it removes the oxide, but doesn't have any effect on the metal underneath it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty sure, if there's anything I'm weak on, it's I have a very spotty education about chemistry. Okay, so I'm right up front. I'm telling you that. But what I do is do that very selectively on kind of a dry towel, so
Mhm.
I don't get into the deep areas, which was unless it was meant to be clean.
Mm-hmm.
And then I buff it by burnishing,
Mm-hmm.
and that way you really haven't removed any material, and maybe you've moved things around a little bit on the surface, but you wind up with a luster on it, and then lacquer it if you wish.
Yeah, I like that. Very, very gentle approach
Yeah.
there, which I think always behooves brass and the aesthetic you're looking for with brass. Yeah, I like that.
But let me bring up though, you talked about patination. I personally patinated over 250 bronzes, or I
Really?
sat next to a guy who did it,
Wow.
either in the Italian foundries in which I've worked, or in the Polish Artworks and Italics here in what used to be Polish Artworks in upstate New York. But the whole idea of when does history stop is interesting discussion. We and here in Newport, there's a I guess twice life-size monument to Rochambeau, because this is where his troops landed when they came from France, and we restored that, and the surface of it. And one of the problems was that the seagulls had figured out he had a flat hat, and the seagulls sat on his hat and pooped down the back of his shoulder, and we go, okay, now the guano is actually part of history, right?
Yeah.
So you say, okay, where do we remove all the guano? None of it? Do we hide it? Do we impregnate it with wax? Where do we pretend that history stopped?
There's a great the Canadian Conservation Institute, Howard, years ago came out with it was a tongue-in-cheek satire on conservation treatments, and what you're describing, that scenario would have gone in there perfectly, just the scientific comical approach that conservators could take to something like guano.
Well, now I'll tell you, my attitude about preserving bronzes is that, again, you don't want to destroy history any more than you have to. And so what happens with bronzes is they start off being patinated simply because they're so active. And if you take a bronze after it's been chased, it means it's metalwork, and it's raw, shiny bronze.
Mm-hmm.
And just before you leave in the evening, you happen to put your hands on it. The next morning, you'll come back and there's your fingerprints. They can find out who did that, by your fingerprints.
Yeah.
So what you do is, step one in dealing with a bronze is you want to passivate the surface.
Yeah.
And most common way to do that is to use sulfides, which give it a sort of a straw a straw, it changed to an oxide that's a light straw, but it largely passivates the surface.
Mhm.
So, and then from there, and I think, a lot of these things were done like in the late 18th century, late 19th century, whenever, that since then, other things have happened that are part of history.
Mhm.
We did an assessment of a thing called the Minuteman back around 1992 or something for the city of Providence in the center of their main in Kennedy Plaza, and we did a whole analysis of it, and it actually was one of, I believe, 50 of these that were 50 casts that were made with the specific idea of having them all last through history so that they could record the different effects of the environment and all the different places in the country where these things were.
Fabulous.
Right. It's a great idea, huh? I turned around and said, yep, don't touch it at all. If you want to solidify it, if you want to stop it a little bit,
Yeah.
let's put some wax on it if it makes you feel good,
Yeah.
And but they instead chose a conservator that took the whole thing, had it bead blasted down to the raw metal, and apply a new brown patina on it, with the rationale that this was the original patina.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, now let me tell you about religious patinas. Back then, I mean, I first made patinas by taking a piece of bronze and lowering it into in Italian what they call a pozzo nero, which means the black pit, which
Yes.
was before they had before they distributed things, distributed human waste. You would poop into a big container, and it would fill up. They let the whole thing rot, and then they'd use it to fertilize the fields.
Yeah.
So the first time I was learning about this, I took a bronze that was about this big and I put it on a hook and I
Yeah.
lowered it into the pozzo nero. Let me tell you, it cleaned it like clean as a whistle. Next morning, there was no patina. But then what I found out later was that if I applied it very carefully, that I did get a patina, very dilute. So what happens when you have these people who go and say, okay, we're going to make an original bronze.
Yeah.
And this was back in the year 1900, okay? What they do is they put a basic patina on it, which is probably mostly sulfides, ammonium sulfide or sodium sulfide, and then maybe they put a layer of ferric chloride on it, which the
Mhm.
chloride becomes neutralized in the environment, so it doesn't create bronze disease. But when and they wash it, so the chlorine is neutralized, I think.
Mhm.
But that's it. They only did it because they knew that within a year it was going to turn green. They all knew that.
Yeah.
Wouldn't you leave it green and leave it the way it is? Because they intended that. They knew it was going to happen,
Mhm.
but they didn't do that. But if you look at what happens in like in front of the in New York City, in front of the New York Library,
Mhm.
look in Italy, they don't take that off. They might clean it up. They might do a very light abrading of the surface to clean waste off of it if you want that history to go away. And then they'll lacquer it or wax it, or just leave it where it is.
I think we have a couple other questions. Heather, are there any other that came in?
Yep, actually, this one's more for you, Camille. To return to the in-house repair of textiles compared to sending it to the conservation specialist. We have buttons that have fallen off dresses, pieces of trim which are loose. Is this something we could do in-house? How do you know when to bring it to a specialist? Our conservation budget is 0. If we did go ahead, what thread should we use?
Okay.
Conservation budget is 0.
Yeah, work on that first of all. But and the first step would be to invest in the continuing education of your staff, volunteers, and interns. So, going to conferences, meeting people like me, Barrett, and asking lots of questions. So the crux of the matter is, can you do any additional harm, either by addition or subtraction? So if we're talking about putting a button on, if I were in a position like that, I would take a thread that's completely different from the original thread, like a polyester thread, as opposed to a wool or cotton thread. And I would reattach that button in a way that made it very obvious that it was done later. And if possible, I would leave the original shards of thread intact as a way to leave a roadmap. Yeah, sewing a button on is a reversible procedure. If you were to take out all the thread or go out and buy a thread that's very much like the original and try to make it look all authentic, then in my opinion, you're actually burying that that trail map that helps somebody understand the history of the object. Sewing a piece of say lace trim back on, if you were to do that in it's white lace on a white gown and there's a gap between the original white cotton thread and the new white cotton thread, if you were to do cotton thread again, which is what our inclination would be, it's not an issue of strength where polyester is helpful, which buttons especially on a coat might need. You can grab another white cotton thread. You don't have to go out of your way to change your thread in that case. You're going to see, you're going to leave a tail, have a knot, start your repair, end your repair, leave a trail. That's also something that somebody can diagnose later. And I think that the thread is probably gone from that opening. So making decisions like that, where you want to minimize your own footprint, try not to subtract in the process, and as always, make sure it's something that's reversible. And if you have any questions, then contact a textile conservator, contact a colleague of yours who is a collections care specialist who has a lot of experience in textiles, and run it by them, because there's no harm in asking. If somebody says, oh my God, you're going to do this terrible thing, then you found it out ahead of time. I personally would rather train a staff how to safely, say, surface clean, vacuum something, so that then they can take their hard-earned $1,000 grant and have me put that towards a part of the preservation that I can't train you to do. That's always my priority, and that's why Barrett and I do things like this. We want you to be as informed as possible. But thank you. That was a really good question. Another conservator might say otherwise, but I say do some research. You can do it yourself.
Great. Any more questions, Heather?
Not in the chat, but we're getting closer to the hour. So if anybody does have any last minute questions they would like to ask our conservators today, go ahead, raise your hand, unmute yourself, or type something in the chat.
I have a question for Camille.
Oh, no, yeah.
What did you think of the Marilyn Monroe dress that was, I don't know how to put it. What was it? One of the Kardashians decided to fit their other size body into it, and it was altered and made huge news in the fashion textile world.
Well, the only good thing about that is that Pete Davidson looked like a gentleman for 5 minutes. But apart from that, I avoided conversation and discussion of this topic. I don't know, I just was repulsed by the whole thing. But my colleague Sarah Scaturo has written about this, and it's on my list of things to read. I'm going to let somebody else do all the hard thinking, and then I'm gonna ingest what they have to say about it.
Gotcha.
I would say I have a philosophy of absolutely zero wearing of historic garments, and I have not personally been involved in any decisions to the contrary that I can say were a reason to break that rule. I don't remember who owns that dress, who loaned it to her, whether it was, I don't know any of the pieces involved, but I was disgusted by it.
Yeah.
Actually.
Hot topic.
Look at all of the royal artifacts that were used as part of the coronation. Is there a difference between re-wearing a robe that Queen Elizabeth wore at her inauguration long before Marilyn Monroe, and Kourtney Kardashian, or whichever one, wearing that gown for the Met Gala? Yes, but you have to really break it down. What are the differences? It's not a black and white question, is it?
No, I think we need to meet on my porch with some wine and some some people that want to talk about this and have a long discussion.
Will there be any like cigar smoke that might get on my clothes if I do
And
that?
scotch, yes, fine cigars, fine
I'm gonna ask
scotch.
you about the Scotch.
Howard can
Alcohol
bring,
will
what's
oxidize
your,
on your clothes. Yeah, no dribbling. That will leave stains. Yeah, you might not
Howard?
eventually, but they'll oxidize. And so
Everybody's welcome. Howard, what's your poison you'll be bringing?
Scotch.
Oh, we've got it
I-
here. We've got it
I
here,
wa-
my friend.
Tequila? How's that? So
We
I
got
like
that too.
no, I wanted to
Sorry.
make it, I wanted to have a comment, Camille brought up something about to what extent you make an alteration look different from what originally was there. And that's an interesting discussion that I've tried various things about it. A lot of people, they come to us as a private operation and not an institution, and they just wish the whole thing would go away. That it never fell down, that the dog didn't knock it over, and what I have a sort of a statutory thing that I say to people, I write it out and say, this will be not obvious to the casual observer, but obvious to the trained eye.
Mm.
And people are usually, I've never had anybody not be fine with that. But it becomes a question of whether, to what extent you make that obvious. One of the solutions we did I have a wonderful collector named Vincenzo Bornano who lives here in Providence, who presented me with a wooden model of a new cupola for San Pietro in Rome. That was all worm-eaten, and it had fallen apart all over the place. And we did a whole restoration of it. But the way we made it so that people could see it was to coat it with a transparent luminescent paint, and gave him a flashlight that was a UV flashlight.
Mhm.
And so that when he wanted to show people where the difference was, he could turn on the flashlight and show them.
Yeah.
So, that was just one alternative to doing that.
Mhm.
Well, to bring it back around to poop, which always comes up in conversation among conservators. Yeah, usually when I'm using my black light, it'll be on garments like I could tell that Shirley Temple peed her pantalettes when she was in a particular costume that I was working on. And I've worked on a lot of bed covers. We'll leave it at that. But I just love how poop always comes back into discussion.
The hidden history of everything, right?
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, well, if we don't have any other questions, I want to remind anybody that, again, if anything comes up in an emergency situation dealing with things like floods, that you can reach out to NEMA, and NEMA can contact me and Barrett, and we can put you in touch with the resources that you need. I'm very sorry to know about all of the threats that have occurred and will continue to occur as climate change impacts us more and more. It is a major part of the concerns of all museum professionals and conservators as much as anybody. And it is really a big issue. Just simple things like keeping your environment steady in an unpredictable climate is a big deal for us. So we want to quickly remind you that we will have one more, or our next fall episode of Ask the Conservators has not yet been scheduled yet, but Barrett and I are going to have a booth at the NEMA conference, and it's going to be an Ask the Conservators booth. And our goal is going to be to basically provide resources on other private practitioners who are in our region that can help you. So please stop by, bring your questions, bring photographs. Please don't bring objects, but bring photographs, and we'll see what we can do. Our idea is just to have a face-to-face version of this in which we might be able to dedicate a little more time specifically to your questions when you're not in sessions. So anything else to add, Barrett?
No, thank you, Camille. Couldn't say it better myself. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Howard, for your wonderful shop and your stories. And thank you, Jen, too. I appreciate everybody and everything you do to make this wonderful meetings happen, that are outreach to the museum world and the public.
I'll see you on your porch.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody, for attending today. The session recording will be available. Definitely thank you to Camille, Howard, and Barrett for sharing your knowledge. And I don't think I've heard poop so much in these things. It's always been about bugs. So I think we definitely hit a level there.
Hope you don't have to go home to young kids.
No, thankfully I do not. All right, so we hope to see you at the fall one or at our annual conference coming up in Portland, Maine in November. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.
Great.
Bye.
Thanks, Heather. Have a happy summer.